Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Tenant Organizing in Unexpected Places, a co-production of MPQ and Shelterforce. I'm Steve Dubb. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
And I'm Miriam Axelute. I'm the editor-in-chief at Shelterforce magazine. My pronouns are she, her. I usually come to you from Albany, New York, Mohican and Haudenosaunee land, but today I'm in Manhattan on Lenape land.
For this webinar, we wanted to talk about the wave of tenant organizing in cities across the country that aren't always on the radar screen of the tenant movement. And for this webinar, we are honored to introduce 4 expert panelists to discuss these issues, who are first, Anneke Dunbar-Gronke, who works as a Scan Fellow for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, focusing on fair housing issues in Baltimore. Gabriela Garcia, who is a project coordinator at BASTA, which stands for Building and Strengthening Tenant Action in Austin, Texas. Josh Poe, who is a tenant organizer with the Louisville Tenants Union and is a co-founder of the Root Cause Research Center, and Wes Pelletier, who is a co-founder of the Trelawney Tenants Union and an organizer with DSA in Portland, Maine. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen. I will share as many of them as I can. Second, we will share the slides and resource recording after the webinar, so please don't ask in the chat or question box if you're going to get the slides and recording. You will. They should arrive by Monday. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing is not. So if you like what we are doing and can afford to support MPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider donating to MPQ today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media with our hashtag #RebuildTheEconomy. Thanks for joining us, and also please complete a brief survey that will be at the conclusion of this 90-minute webinar. And with that, I will pass the baton to my co-moderator, Miriam Axelute.
Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But right before we jump into that, I want to give us and our panelists a little bit of a sense of who's here and what your experience with tenant organizing is, so that it can inform our conversation a little bit. So I'm going to launch a very simple poll, and if you could just fill it out, that would help us a lot. I'm going to share the results just so everybody knows. It looks like we have a spread here on the call, with a lot of people being somewhat familiar, good chunk of people being very familiar, but also some folks who are not at all or a little bit familiar with tenant organizing. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Josh Poe to tell us about some of his work in Louisville.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you, Steve, for hosting. My name is Josh Poe. I use the he, him set of pronouns, and I am really proud to be from Eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region of Kentucky. I grew up working in tobacco fields, and so I actually started organizing as a child, working in tobacco fields. Child labor was legal, still legal in tobacco country, and so we organized to get wages as children. And from there, I started organizing in Seattle. I started doing tenant organizing in Seattle with what was then called Washington Citizens Action. I have a really strong background as an impacted person, deeply impacted by racial capitalism. I experienced houselessness, incarceration, substance abuse. I'm in recovery, but also have a really solid policy background. I was able to go to get a degree in urban planning, and which really benefited taking that information about how real estate capital works into tenant organizing. So I've been doing tenant organizing in Louisville for over 10 years. I also did a lot of policy work, but what we found in Kentucky is that without a base of people to really move policy work that wasn't enough to build power. And so in 2022, we felt like we had a solid base of tenants organized in Louisville to actually start a citywide tenant union. So the Louisville Tenant Union began in March or April of 2022. We won our first campaign, and we now have over 200 dues-paying members, and have a local campaign, a state level campaign, and then we organize nationally as part of the Homes Guarantee campaign.
Thanks, Josh. Gabriela Garcia, Gabby, do you want to introduce your work in Austin and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Gabby Garcia. I use she, her pronouns. I am originally from El Paso, and I have been doing various types of organizing since college. I've been with BASTA 4 years. I'm the project coordinator and also organizer here. And so BASTA started in 2016, and it was spurred by dangerous and substandard conditions that were happening all around Austin, and there wasn't really anything that was happening. And so like there were 2 balcony collapses around that time. And so at that point, people were like, there's a systemic issue, and there, other than direct services for people having individual issues, there wasn't anybody doing organizing to work on the systemic issues. And so that's kind of how BASTA was born. Right. Our bread and butter is organizing, and we have 2 teams. We have our BASTA organizing team, and we focus solely on helping tenants at various apartment complexes organize tenant associations. And then pretty recently, we added an additional team that focuses on eviction mitigation. And so they're the BASTA eviction mitigation team. And the thread for both of those is that both projects are trying to shift the balance of power that exists between landlords and tenants, because we know tenants have very little power, even though there are more tenants in the city here. And so we believe that organizing efforts, in order to be successful, should be led by those who are most impacted. And I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Gabby. And so turn over to Wes Pelletier to talk about Portland, Maine.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so I've been involved with tenant organizing for almost half a decade now. I'm not really sure how I got involved, but it just sort of happened. And we started doing tenant outreach in terms of rights and trying to make sure that people who were at risk of getting evicted knew their rights. And then during COVID, I organized a union within my building, which is one by one of the bigger landlords in town. And we built on that with my work in DSA. We've passed rent control in Portland alongside a slate of tenant protections, and have defended those. And really, a lot of it is figuring out, how to sort of come at tenant rights and housing protection from both like a policy angle as well as an organizing angle, and especially when those in charge aren't particularly interested in tenant rights. So. Yeah, very much excited to learn from my fellow panelists here.
Great. Thanks, Wes. Anneke, would you like to talk about yourself and some of your work?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Anneke Dunbar-Gronke. As Steve mentioned, I'm a Skadden Fellow. I have 3 more days as a Skadden Fellow with the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. My personal background, I've been working and supporting organizing around Black land and housing issues for over a decade. I have a family history of displacement in the South and on the West Coast and Bay Area. But I've also been working with anti-gentrification organizers for many years in in New York against Columbia's expansion into Manhattanville and Harlem, with public housing tenants in New Orleans, with an organization called a group called Stand with Dignity, and also with anti-displacement organizers in Boston. And so I share that to say that my background in organizing really and all of these experiences and all of the things that I've learned from organizers over the years have grounded my legal work and continue to. And so since I began in this position, I've been working almost exclusively in Baltimore since 2021, and I provide direct representation of tenants in rent court, but most of my time is spent supporting Baltimore Renters United, which is a newer base building tenant-led base building organization, and I provide legal strategy and policy support, and also do some organizing of attorneys to support that work, in addition to some transactional advising of like cooperatives and land trusts, in addition to some fair housing matters in other jurisdictions. So also trying to be available for impact litigation.
Thanks, Anneke, and all of you for the great work that you're doing. So we want to jump in to start off, especially because we have some folks here who are new to thinking about tenant organizing, some folks on the call. Can you all tell us how you define what is tenant organizing and why is that the definition that makes sense to you?
I struggle a lot with even defining organizing, honestly, just because it's kind of nebulous. But to me, it is getting people together to do something that they might not normally do that benefits the greater whole. And that's something that's very, it obviously fits in with tenant organizing. And because these are people's homes that they're having to pay for and live in fear, obviously, a lot of the time. So it comes down to a lot of the time building class consciousness, and understanding that, it is sort of strange that this is the setup. And then also a lot of it comes down to like learning how to be in meetings and learning how to have conversations and learning how to talk to other people, which are skills that are less common than maybe they used to be. But just getting people used to like knocking on each other's doors, and whether it's for asking for sugar or whether it's asking for, somebody to sign a letter or wear a button, just that sort of coming together and building a community while also building awareness of the system and how we can sort of come together to make it even a little bit more equitable.
Anyone else want to jump into that question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We define it pretty simply as just a group of tenants who've come together to achieve things collectively that they couldn't have achieved as individuals. One of the things we really try to connect with our members when we first engage them is the difference between advocacy, service, and organizing. I think those are three very distinct things, and I think in this country we conflate those three things. But they're very different, and organizing is really about power building, and it's about building power based on it's about uncovering our individual self-interest and then building power based around those shared self-interests.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the way that we define it as well. Whenever we're going into a property, people are starting off thinking, like, if they're not talking to their neighbors, they're like, oh, this is only my issue. And management definitely tries to make it seem like, let's say there's like a pest issue, you have rats. Well, it's your fault because you're dirty and you did this. But then you start talking to neighbors and it's everywhere. This is a conflict, like it's happening throughout the complex. And so, yeah, it's people coming together and realizing that what's happening to them is a more systemic issue. And then working with them from there to figure out, okay, we all have this issue. We've identified it, but now what are we going to do about it? Like, how can we find solutions that are going to help everybody and not just me individually? And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. Just letting people that they're not alone in this, and this is a lot bigger.
Well, I can go into the next question, and maybe I'll direct it to Anneke first, just to get you into the mix. But how would you I mean, you've written about this. So how does tenant organizing build power? And, you know, I was thinking about sort of some of the, you know, the different roles, you know, the organizing and service and advocacy roles. So maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, this is really just adding to what all of the folks who are spending all of their time organizing have already said as well. But I think that from my perspective as an attorney, you know, I'm wearing my attorney hat a lot of the time. The power that I have seen built, I mean, first of all, of course, there's numbers. Like it's in the way that like labor organizing is really powerful, because most people have to have a job in order to live. Most people have to have a house, or are having an issue with housing, or are unhoused. Everyone has a relationship to where they need to be, where they need to lay their head. And so there are a lot of people that that can be engaged to move things. I mean, when folks have when the more people are around an issue, the more energy there is around the issue, the more people are talking about an issue, and the more people, and that leads to more people being willing to do something about an issue. And that's just kind of, I feel like that's sort of just fundamental, like organizing math, or that's not so scientific, but it feels like science to me. It's the only science I'm going to be doing anytime soon. But I think that as an attorney, I am often talking to organizers about the limitations of the law. And I think that's a really important conversation to always be having. It feels, I know that the law can exert a lot of power over folks' lives. And also it is so not powerful for supporting the causes of tenants. It's not built. I often describe the law as a tool for moving resources, and moving resources only. It's not a tool for justice. It's rarely a tool for justice for the folks that are most marginalized, folks who are undocumented, Black folks, anybody who is not like a wealthy white male landowner in like 1756. Like that's not who, you know, those are the folks that most laws were written for. And like we try to pass better laws, we try to pass better policies that often are that can cabin, you know, the foundational laws of this nation. But it's really, you know, these tools are very imperfect for that purpose. And the thing that will actually shift the balance of power, shift, you know, the balance of resources and move resources, redistribute resources into communities that have been historically marginalized and excluded. It's going to happen through organizing. And so what I try to offer when I you know, bring the legal tools, where it's my job to be good at executing the legal tools, and I always want to make it in support of a legal strategy, in support of you know, a group of people that is coming together and you know, knocking on each other's doors and talking to each other, and to bring that tool in the least disruptive way possible, so that people can keep building power, because the law's never going to do that.
Thanks. Wes, I thought maybe this would be a good place for you to sort of dig into a little bit of you organized your own building. So that was an instance of building tenant power. Maybe talk about that experience.
Sure. So this was when lockdown first started, and we'd been talking about trying to figure out how to do tenant unions for a long time, and had sort of hit a wall because Portland is basically like a biggish town. It's the biggest city in Maine, but it's so small. It's like 60,000 people, 70,000 people. So we don't have a ton of services. And basically people are just trying to keep their heads down. And we have obviously no cause evictions. So it just makes people very scared. We've had one tenant union before mine, and it got crushed. So starting in lockdown, you know, it was very scary all around, both on a community level, in terms of just like, what happens if my neighbor dies or something like that, and also on a, just a financial level, obviously. So I and some others started up basically just started as a Discord server, which is just like a chat room. And, you know, I knew, okay, we're going to try to organize around this, but wanted to first start building the community around it. And then from that, with the help of some of the people that lived in my building, including like a former mayor, we started figuring out, okay, how are we going to engage with the landlord, and how are we going to start collecting demands? And it's definitely not a we didn't make a perfect tenant unit, and we are still sort of trying to figure out what it is. I think one of the hardest things is definitely creating a power structure, and creating like a sense of what it is. And it is more of a community now that sends angry emails and meets with the landlord every once in a while. But that idea, where we are engaging on both, we are engaging as a service, and that part kind of kills me. But it is just like, oh yeah, we're going to email the city and make them enforce this rule. And also knocking doors, trying to have dinners, like have stuff out behind the building, and trying to thread those two things while also, trying to set an example and meet and try to get people to organize their own building, because we don't have any paid staffers, obviously, in DSA or really many organizations around town that are trying to organize tenants. So yeah, it's really just been trial and error, and figuring out how to build power while also, making sure that people feel connected, and like bought in and part of the whole.
Thanks. Josh, you guys are fairly new too, so you maybe talk about the building of the tenants union in Louisville.
Yeah,
and maybe there's like a question in the chat about, or in the question box about organizing in a red state. Obviously, you're in a red state, so might give that context too.
Yeah, I can hit on that. I think the question is really twofold. I think there are two parts to this question. Is one, how do we organize? And then how does our organizing build power? And so we really try to organize around self-interest as opposed to ideology. I think in this country, when you organize around ideology, you end up with a room full of people who have the same ideology as you. And we don't necessarily have enough of those people to win. And so, for instance, when we go into trailer parks, a lot of people in trailer parks, their rents increase. Their trailer parks now owned by a corporate landlord. They see brown people moving into their neighborhood, and they tend to blame that because we don't have the best public education system in this country, and people don't really have a way of explaining what's happening to them politically, but they are outraged. And so we try to connect directly to that outrage, and then bring them into a base of people who don't necessarily look like them, and then uncover their self-interest and get them to understand that they actually share the same self-interest of these people that they've been told that they're actually segregated from. And so understanding that self-interest is really key. I think in the South, I think this is true of the whole country with the working class, but I think it's particularly true in the South, is that we've been trained to be selfless, and we've been trained to give up our power over and over again. And it's important to understand that we're not really doing that in and of ourselves. That's a tactic of the ruling class. And so getting people to understand what their self-interest is, and then getting them to act in that self-interest and getting them to declare that publicly is a real key part. And then the way we build power on top of that is to, getting them to behave as a collective. But very simply, the working class in this country, I believe there are two things we have that's real, and that's our rent and that's our labor. And so I think the real potential of the tenant movement is that if we can build a large enough base across this country, there's a day when we can make the call for a national rent strike and bring this entire system crashing down, and then dictate the demands that we actually want. And so I tell people, if you're interested in environmental justice, if you're interested in carceral justice, tenant organizing to me is really the thing that's going to win and build the power in this country to shift the power dynamic that we currently have. And as far as a red state goes, I think it's real important to keep in mind that in a place like Kentucky, it's not actually a red state, it's a purple state. The majority of the population does not vote. We have voting districts in Kentucky where 70% of the people aren't voting. At the same time, the Kentucky Democratic Party didn't run candidates in 40 districts last year. So we see that as a real opportunity to build tenant power in the South and connect with people around their material self-interest. I actually think that tenant organizing is the way we win in the South and in red states in general.
Great. Gabby, anything you want to add?
I think we have a really similar approach. Is that, like we don't approach people with that ideology. We try to meet them where they're at, right? Because some of what Wes was saying, like, you don't want to hear about ideology in the moment that like your roof is caving in or whatever. Like, you're focused on survival, and so you need to start there. And then get people to see those wider connections. And then going back to what Anneke was saying, I think one of the things too, like the way that you build power is once you have a tenant association, those groups can show up in spaces where they normally aren't, right? Like if there's like a city meeting and they're deciding things about tenants, or if it's like a commission or a county commission or whatever, tenants are never at those places because they're working and they're doing things. And so other people are deciding what happens in their lives, these major issues that affect them without that voice being heard. And so what a tenant association allows you to do is have people in those places, you know, telling their stories, giving a different perspective, and having a voice where they didn't have one before. So that's, I believe, another way that you build that power. And then also I think what both Josh and Wes were saying, like the base is so important. Like you're not going to have a successful tenant association or build real change if you only have two leaders and the rest of the base isn't engaged, right? You need a group, and there needs to be accountability and a collective thought process, not just like, how do I fix my individual issue, but like, how are we benefiting everybody here, even people that don't show up to the meetings. And that's the hard part.
Great. That's a great segue into our next question, which you've sort of started to answer. And, you know, the way that we framed this particular webinar was to bring in folks from places that are not, don't have these decades of tenant organizing in the high cost coastal cities that people think of. And so the question is, how does your location and the political context that you're in affect how you're organizing? And you did start to say that, but you know, sometimes you have a hostile state government, I'm actually going to bring in a question from the chat. Also, is a question from someone in Maui who's working mostly in rural and suburban settings, which may be different than working in urban settings. So if you can all talk a little bit about the way that your context and your location affects how you go about it and how you approach policy and organizing.
I think Josh had already started talking about it. I mean, in the South, I like to joke with people that like, we're starting from the rock bottom and there's nowhere to go but up from there, right? But yeah, like there isn't a culture of organizing in the South. If you're in New York, like people know what tenant unions are, what tenant associations are, and here you're introducing this concept to people for the very first time, and so you're dealing with that. And we don't even like, because it's Texas, we don't even have a strong like labor organizing here. So like the whole concept of it is very foreign. And so you're starting like at the very ground, and then you have like state laws, and just like any little win that they're repealing those things, and the laws are so much in favor of the landlords, like you don't have the right to organize it in Texas. And so what managers often do, if we're having a tenant association meeting on property, they'll call the police, and the police will threaten the organizer with criminal trespass and tell the people who live there to go home. And this is just like a normal thing. And so not only does it disrupt the meeting that you're trying to have, but it completely intimidates the people who are brave enough to show up to that meeting. And every time the police will always take the side. So these are the things that you're dealing with on a daily basis. And so, yeah, like we're really, really starting from the bottom.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Gabby said. I think for organizers, it's so important to do deep research on power in their localities, and especially the history of power, and to really know who the most powerful people are and how they're making decisions, and what we're up against. And again, I'm going to echo what Gabby said. I found, you know, I've spent most of my life in Kentucky. I'm still learning about the political economy of Kentucky, and it's been a lifelong pursuit. And so, follow the money and really understand just where interest lies. I think one of the things that we've learned organizing in the South is that retaliation is real. We ran a campaign last year. Every leader that spoke out publicly was retaliated against in some way by our local housing authority and a private property management company, including one leader who got a brick thrown through her car window the day before a city council meeting. And so those kind of things happen. I don't know what retaliation looks like elsewhere, but I know that in the South it's very swift and it's very severe. And there's an entire apparatus that's been in place for hundreds of years to prevent the type of organizing from happening that we're doing. One of the things that we really were able to hit on locally is to follow the subsidies. We don't have power in Louisville to take on Blackstone. Blackstone's our largest landlord in Louisville, Kentucky, large corporate landlord out of California. We can't take on Blackstone today, but what we found is a lot of the buildings that we've organized get low-income housing tax credit money, get some form of subsidy from some entity. And so in every state, there's low-income housing tax credit money. There's a state allocating agency that provides that money. And so if you can organize enough tenants, you can go to your local government or state government who's subsidizing those landlords and pressure them to make protections. And the kind of the strategic plan there is to get those wins. And then as you get the wins, you build up a stronger base so that in 3 or 4 years, we can take on Blackstone. We can take on the large corporate landlords.
I think what, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, please.
You sure? Okay. I think that, there are so many things, and I'm going to try to keep it brief. I know that lawyers can talk a lot, and I want to not do that here because there's a lot of brilliance being shared here. I think just a few things on Gabby's point about sort of like, when you mentioned police, I had been thinking about the work that we specifically do in Baltimore City and in the different places that I've worked to support organizing. I think that when thinking about the political context that affects tenant organizing, the intentional fractioning of Black community has historically disrupted the things that Wes was talking about at the beginning about like what defines tenant organizing, being in relationship, being able to knock on your neighbor's door, being able to even like see your neighbor. Mass incarceration, policing, the prison industrial complex, criminalization, all of those things have really intentionally destroyed communities and has impacted organizing for a long time. And Miriam, one of the things that you said about like focusing on organizing in rural and like not anywhere but the big major coastal cities, where tenant and housing organizing is happening less. I think it's been happening for a really long time. It was just more effectively dismantled in those places. I would say that the civil rights movement was a housing justice movement, folks, and like a lot of the power that was built was possible because of some folks who had property and had, there were places where folks could gather. And I think that, in Baltimore, there was a really powerful housing and tenant organizing movement in the 1960s. They got folks fired. They were able to mobilize to get a rent control ordinance that was passed in the 1970s that I didn't know about. And most of the organizers that I work with, folks who had lived, who were, born and raised in Baltimore, didn't know about. It's interesting to see that was, or to recognize that like that was passed. And then, the beginning of what we call like sort of the modern mass incarceration trend started right around then. And then, and it functionally gutted the capacity of Black communities to organize because you need people, as we've talked about, and if a bunch of people are in cages, it's not possible. And so when I talk to folks about defund and abolition and all of these things, I really just don't think that anything that we think about or any of the changes that we want to see in like policing is incarceration and criminal legal and in the criminal legal system is possible until we shift our relationship to property, because the fact of the matter is that the way that property law the property law system in this country was conceived of at a time when Black people were property and native land was just thought of as like a place for white settlement and eventual takeover after the murder of folks who already were there. And so I think that I say that to say that we're all living in this like really fucked up system. And I am really excited about what you said, Josh, about the need to organize around like self-interest, or well, everyone has been talking about that, but I wrote it down when you said it, the need to organize around self-interest. Sometimes I've heard that called like a program versus ideology, because ideology is inherently competitive. But when there's a program, when there's self-interest, there's something that folks are identifying with each other. And I think that there's a lot of cultural organizing that I see happening that is so pivotal to creating the communities that a lot of marginalized folks have had sort of ripped away from them, rather from all of us. And on the power mapping point, I just want to offer that I think that that's a way that attorneys can be helpful. Aside from, not everybody's a litigator, but I think that we're all trained to be researchers on power structures. And some of us are more effective than others. I'm trying to be effective, but I'm no expert. I work with folks who are experts. Shout out to, I think I've been seeing Bridget from the National Housing Law Project. She's a phenomenal, person for that. And I've definitely connected her with organizers on the ground here to figure out where the hell the LIHTC money is going, what is going on at HUD, who can we talk to at HUD, who's the appropriate target at HUD to get the thing done that we need to get done in Baltimore City, right? And so I just wanted to offer that as something that it's another way that lawyers can fit into the political context of organizing in a way that I think can be helpful.
Just to add on to that very briefly. We've passed rent control, we've like expanded it, and that feels like a win. But one of the criticisms that we get, that the law has gotten and we've gotten from immigrant advocacy groups, is that the law doesn't really matter if you are undocumented or there's a language barrier, because the city is not going to proactively enforce it. And even if they were, with no cause evictions, that is putting people's, why stick your neck out, right? Like, just go find a new place to live, or leave the city, and that's what we're seeing a lot. Or just, you don't have a house anymore, and otherwise you have to navigate, the morass of like legal advocacy programs, and like, what are you going to do? Email your city councilor? And that is really one of the struggles. And it's why, people are asking, in Maine, how can we get rent control here? And I hate to shut them down a little bit, but it's like, okay, like, you're going to be entering a forever war, basically. And we have a very strong understanding of how our city council works. And it is, liberal leaning leftist, but that's not the case in the rest of Maine. But like, on the brighter side, tenant protections that exist in Maine, they were first started in the 1970s because a trailer park organized a tenant union to get a pool. And like, that sort of it's so much easier to organize if you aren't in a mortal fight. And if you can come together and sort of realize like these small indignities that are piling up are shared. And the trick is creating a system and whether you're coming in or in there already, it's creating a system where people feel like it's not weird to go and talk and hang out, and have that structured in a way where you are working towards something and you are building something and you are organizing. And yeah, I don't think it should be organizing to pass a referendum, as much as like that is the tool we keep coming back to, because those are just so easy to fight. Although if you can get it, don't get it.
Well, that leads it well into our next question, which is really about what role can tenant organizing play in changing city and state housing policy. And obviously rent control is one area. There's also a question that one of the people in this webinar talked about in terms, increasing rights for tenant unions or other types of organizing. But, how can tenant organizing play an effective role in changing city and state housing policy?
I'll jump into that first. I think I got a short answer, and I would add national policy to that also, Steve. And so I think it just when we talk about these issues, I mean, it doesn't matter what issue we bring up, like it's a question of power, right? And so tenant organizing can build power for working class people. We tend to run two types of issues. We have issue-based campaigns, which were more along the line of what Wes was just referring to. Say, we've organized buildings where we've drafted fair leases. And then we've ran campaigns against those landlords to get a fair lease. And that's more like a labor campaign. You're really organizing for a contract. And we've ran campaigns where tenants have decided that they wanted a new property management company. We had a really terrible property management company in Louisville. People wanted them out of town. And we ran a campaign like that. And then we've also ran policy campaigns. And so those are just two ways that we go about that. And I think a lot of times, those two types of campaigns are very different, and they function differently. The issue-based campaigns directly against landlords, those are the campaigns where we typically see more retaliation against tenants. The policy campaigns tend to be safer campaigns, but they don't necessarily build us as much power, and the base doesn't get as excited by them also. And then what we've also found is even when you win a policy campaign, as Wes alluded to, it sometimes the implementation side is lacking there. But I think the national campaign that we organize with Homes Guarantee is a really good example of how a national campaign can support local organizing. And so last year we were a member of the Homes Guarantee campaign. We were part of the first tenant delegation to ever go to the White House in the history of the country. And we didn't get what we wanted out of that campaign. We wanted an executive order on rent control. But some good things came out of that. And one of the things that came out of that is that the Federal Housing Finance Agency opened up a comment portal where they're taking comments from tenants until July 31st on things like rent regulations, like good cause eviction in those properties that are federally subsidized by Fannie and Freddie. And so we've really used that to strengthen our base building. We've been able to, it's a lot of the people we talk to are locked in hopelessness, and they're locked in this sort of inevitability of hopelessness that, my rent's increasing, I want to move, but there's not really a place to move, and they're locked into that. And so being able to take a tenant to Washington, D.C. and put them in front of a decision maker who has the power to materially change their living condition really helps with our base building. And then those tenants typically come back and feel a lot more powerful. And so the power that they feel translates to bringing in other tenants. And so we've been able to leverage our policy campaigns for the type of power building that we need and bringing in more people.
Great, Josh. There's a couple comments in the chat, so I just want to ask you about briefly, is there still the ability to comment on the federal campaign, or what's the status of that?
There is, and I will drop a link in the chat for that. Great. Thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question of city and state policy and what tenant organizing can achieve?
And I mean, unless anyone else has anything to add, I think that one thing that I think I've seen in a few different places is, organizing offers like a vision of what could be, and through really powerful direct actions, it can really like show people what's at stake. One of my favorite lines from a Lorraine Hansberry play that I love is that am I a fool to believe that death is a waste, right? And like that's really the whole thing. Like we want people to have homes, we want people to be able to stay where they are and be in communities, because if they don't, people are dying. Like people will die. It hurts them, it hurts their health, it hurts their well-being, and people are dying. And so I think that the way that organizers and and tenant leaders can sort of just like get to the point of what the fuck we're talking about when there are a bunch of lawyers and policy people and elected officials trying to talk about like subsidies and bylaws and whatever they can to obscure the issue that's at hand. When organizers, when tenants with stories of what's going on can show up and really cut through the bullshit, for lack of a better term, I think that that's really effective, and it helps people like me who often are sort of tasked with like doing the translation and going to talk to the elected officials like on their with their language. I'm like, actually what I'm really talking about is this tenant who came to Annapolis and talked to you, Annapolis is the capital of Maryland, that came to the Capitol yesterday in this hearing and told you that if you don't do something, if you don't vote for this tomorrow, they're going to be unhoused with their kids. you know? And so I think that that's, that kind of narrative shift and narrative capture is really, really powerful. And I also think that, when I'm sorry, earlier I said exposing more radical possibilities. If the alternative that folks are seeing is that, organizers are occupying vacant homes or physically imposing, creating eviction lines to prevent folks from being evicted so that the sheriff can't even get in, then when we're having the policy discussion in the minds of all of those folks, all of those decision makers, then they're like, well, if we don't do something, then more of that's going to happen. And so I think fear, instilling fear in the hearts of powerful people or people who are decision makers, and letting them know like where the power really lies, which is with the people when they come together and come up with solutions on their own because the government or whatever, the powers that be are refusing to do so. That is what I have seen. And I think will continue to be the most impactful thing.
Great, thank you. I want to ask a question about, so we've talked a lot about creating the community and the relationship and understanding a self-interest that goes among a group of tenants. How have any of you worked with groups of tenants who are not physically proximate? So whether you're working in a really rural area that doesn't have it's not a mobile home park, or working with tenants in single family homes, which of course we all know the single family rental has skyrocketed suburban areas. So tenants who may have a common landlord but don't have a lobby to meet in, don't interact in the halls, don't know which doors to knock on because they don't know who has that shared interest with them. Have any of you worked in situations like that? Do you have any thoughts or things to recommend?
We ran a campaign last year against the local housing authority, and their properties were countywide, and we were able to organize all those tenants into one campaign. And the way we did that was, we just held regular meetings, and we have a transportation team, so we're able to get people, and there are a lot of people live far out in the county. We're able to get people to those meetings, and yeah, we were able to build a large enough base to win that campaign.
So providing transportation and doing the research to know who the base is that's affected by the particular issue would be some of the recommendations.
And I think one of the keys with that campaign is the base pushed us on that. We really pushed, I particularly pushed our base toward more of a policy campaign, but the base was very adamant that about the campaign that they wanted. And so since they pushed for it, they were more likely to be engaged, since it was an issue that actually came from them.
Great, thanks. I wanted to ask, a lot of the work, obviously, of tenant unions is to protect people's security of tenure. And we've seen rising eviction rates post-pandemic. What would be the best advice that you can give anyone facing a threat of eviction, and how do tenant unions respond? Are able to leverage use organizing to improve people's odds of staying in their homes.
I can try to speak a little to that bit, because and it's a complicated answer, because I feel like that was kind of why we ended up creating a separate team that does eviction mitigation. Because like the whole reason, like one of the things that landlords always have hanging over your head is that they can't evict you, right? And so anytime that tenants are organizing, it's a risk. And we always want to be really clear with people, like there very likely will be retaliation against you. And in extreme cases, like the landlord could evict you for any number of reasons, or not renew your lease. And so that's a very big thing. But oftentimes that undermines the organizing, because when you start to see tenant leaders being evicted, that's like the scarlet letter. And then maybe people who are starting to get close are like, oh no, I'm not going to touch that. And so what we really try to do is getting evicted is like, people who go through that process take it very personally, and they feel like it's like a failure, an individual failure. And so we try to show, first of all, that it's not, right. Like, this is a systemic issue, and it's the whole system and the way that it's set up. It's not to benefit tenants. It's not to give them a chance to be able to stay in their homes. It's so that's part of it. And then the other part of it is just that in general, people don't know what the eviction process is, right? They get that first notice on the door, says be out in 3 days, and they're like, I'm evicted, I get out. And there are a lot of self evictions without going through the process. And so the way that we've been handling it is we like that immediate need of like keeping your housing and like trying to figure out if like you can get somebody to represent you in court, like that's gonna take precedence over trying to organize because of the issues in your home. And here in Texas, like, we don't, like, your roof literally could be caving in, and the judge is going to evict you because you owe $10. It doesn't matter that your roof is caving in, like, the conditions don't matter. It's whether or not you paid. So yeah, I think they're both very, very connected, but sometimes because of the way that we go about organizing, we have like, that has to be focused on first. And then it's different also, like if it's a mass eviction, then you can build a campaign if everybody's being evicted and try to do something that way. But if it's them picking people off, it's more complicated.
Yeah, one thing we struggle with is if someone's getting evicted, it might be too late. So like, I think everyone on this call, even if you don't rent, like, just get used to building community, get used to talking to your neighbors, and like, be weird and like go ask for something that you would have to run out to the store for, because like once you start building those connections, then you're going to start having those conversations. But then also, of course, like Gabby was saying, like, and you, like, if you hear of this, they don't move, right? Pay your rent, like keep doing everything as normal, document everything. Like there is a lot of like, and that only goes so far, like, in terms of like, the color of your skin or your economic status, but like, there are ways that you can at least make it a pain in the ass for them to have to kick you out. The mayor who lives in Trelawney, he got evicted because he was organizing, and he's been there for the last 2 years after having been evicted because he's tied them up in court. And that's the result of resources and of a lot of different kinds of resources. But like, unless it's non-payment of rent, wait till the sheriff knocks on your door, honestly, because like that's your home. And I think it does empower people to see you take a stand, but also, make sure you're protected. Sometimes you do have to leave because the circumstances demand it. But yeah, don't be afraid of the landlord. Be polite and follow the rules, to their face.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think both your all's answers were so good that I'm going to stretch it out a little bit and talk about how we define eviction. Because if someone's facing an eviction through the court, then obviously they need a lawyer. And I think that everything everybody said is really applicable. But if we define eviction more broadly and think about a lease renewal, right, then obviously if you're facing that type of eviction, then the answer is to organize a tenants union and try to get a good cause ordinance passed. And so what we found in Louisville is that only looking at evictions that happen through the courts drastically undercount what's actually an eviction. And so we've defined evictions a lot more broadly. And we actually have a lot of homeowners, especially Black homeowners, who've joined the tenants union because they feel very threatened with houselessness. And so what we find when we canvass is that a Black homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood, the city codes department is paying a lot of attention to their houses, right? And they're dinging them for things like gutters hanging off. And if they get too many code violations and get too many fines, then they're going to lose their housing. And that's actually also, and we see that as a process of displacement, dispossession, and eviction. And so we actually have a chapter of the tenant union called the Historically Black Neighborhood Ordinance that's wrote a policy. A lot of Black folks in the tenant union And specifically, one of our organizers, Jessica Bellamy, felt like Black people needed their own space to focus on Black land and Black land repossession, and wrote an ordinance that would limit local government's ability to subsidize market rate housing and housing that would displace. So what we found is like a lot of the displacement that's occurring in our neighborhoods is occurring because our local government is actually subsidizing market rate or subsidizing just below market rate, and that's triggering rent increases. And so I think we need to really change the way we think about eviction and define it a lot more broadly in order to really address it. But yeah, my advice to any tenant, like Gabby and Wes said, is to start building power with your neighbors to fight against all forms of dispossession.
And I'll just add very briefly, I love everything that you all are saying. And then, you know, on that last point, Josh, I think, you know, you can be a tenant of a landlord or you can be a tenant of the bank. You know, we're all still tenants, and there are lots of ways to build across. You might have more protections as a homeowner, but that's, especially if you're a Black homeowner, there's all kinds of things that can happen. I think the one thing that I would add to the definition of eviction is like, it's not just the person that's evicted, it's also all of their stuff. And we've, there was a bill that was going through the Maryland legislature this year. We called it the landlord take your stuff bill, because there are lots of different laws in different states about this. Some states are better, some states are worse, but you know, in some cases, like, landlords can kind of just take whatever you leave behind and they can, if you don't know exactly the time that they're going to lock you out, you're not going to have access to the stuff that you've left inside. And that can include birth certificates. It can, include lists of phone numbers for all of the folks that you hold dear in your neighborhood. It can include, like family, all kinds of things. And so I think that the one thing I would add, yes, don't be afraid of your landlord, connect with your neighbors, get legal representation if it's accessible to you. And if it's not, practice what you're going to say, even if a judge is trying to interrupt you when you go into court, practice it in the mirror and be prepared to just tell your story, get it on the record, do everything that you can, and show up to your case if you can. Also, that's a really big thing that I always advise folks, even if I can't represent them. But I think, making a plan for your most important things in the the worst case scenario that you are being put out, so that to the degree that you can, you're not also in a position of you're not finding a new place and also having to replace a bunch of important things that you've lost or really realistically have been stolen from you. But the law often doesn't define it that way, even though that's what it is.
So this morning, I was spending some time with the Northwest Bronx Clergy and Community Coalition, and they were talking about, they do tenant organizing, they have for decades, and they've had a number of wins, but they're talking about feeling like they were sort of continually falling behind, and they're still doing their tenant organizing, but they're also wanting to move toward shifting these buildings to cooperative ownership as opposed to constantly fighting landlords. So their end goal in a lot of places is community ownership, creating limited equity co-ops and community land trusts as a way of actually really shifting the power dynamics. And I wonder if that topic is on any of your radars, or how you think about it in relation to power building and organizing.
Yeah, it's a huge piece of what we're doing. We've been organizing in a public housing site, and our goal there is to form a resident management corporation and then eventually move that into collective ownership. We have several buildings where we've organized, and honestly, if we could get the funding and could get an apparatus around it, we could move those buildings into collective ownership. One of the things we're really clear with when we talk to power holders and politicians is that we are giving away money and land to developers constantly. The money and land that we give away could go to a senior apartment building. It could go to an apartment building, and then the rents that people pay would be put back into the maintenance of that building rather than to a corporate landlord in Boston. So that's something that's on our radar. And also the Historically Black Neighborhood Assembly is really focused on Black land repossession. And there's actually a mechanism within the ordinance that they wrote that would allow families who've had who can prove that they lost their land through discriminatory practices to then get land back from local government.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important to try to decommodify land and we definitely need more and we need investment. And that's not just like in order to be able to purchase the land or the build or whatever that is, but to keep supporting it after that. There's a mobile home park that we had been working with for years, and they were able to successfully buy their mobile home park in the middle of the pandemic. They did it, they got a loan through Rock USA. The problem is that there wasn't, but they're having a difficult time right now because there wasn't good technical assistance. And so, you know, people don't know how to run a mobile home park. And so the management companies that they hired, they're still management companies, right? They still, even though they are the owners, they treat them like they're tenants and don't get things done. And so without having the technical support to be able to run the mobile home park correctly, they are the owners, and that, like, in that way, it's great. But as far as the conditions and, you know, them feeling ownership, that's still lacking. And so I think that we have to find a way to be able to do both. Like, if we can get tenants to the place where they have a community land trust or a co-op or whatever it is, making sure that there's ongoing support to be able to run it in a way that, you know, they do have dignified housing, and it's not just like on paper that they're owners. Yeah.
Anneke, I know you wrote a bit about Baltimore and some of the effort there. Could you add a little bit on that?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, thank you for the prompt. I forgot about that. So I think that, you know, in Baltimore, someone mentioned in the chat, TOPA and COPA, tenant for folks who might not know what that means, tenant opportunity to purchase acts. Those are laws that have been passed that give tenants opportunity to purchase if if first opportunity to purchase if a property is being transferred over to another owner. I think that those are great, and that those kinds of laws have been used to alongside, you know, creative financing and cooperative funds, have been used to transition some public housing that might otherwise have been privatized. And I think in places like Washington, D.C., that's been done. I think it's happened in the Bay Area as well. Sorry, San Francisco Bay Area as well. And then one thing that is also helpful is organizing for mechanisms, laws or mechanisms, policies that get money moved out of cooperative funds or land trust funds quickly. I know that Tisha Guthrie is on this call. Shout out to Baltimore. She's on the Baltimore Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which folks organized around and, you know, got created and led to the creation of like a fund that has millions of dollars that go towards community land trusts and cooperatives and affordable housing. But the holdup has been that it's really difficult to get the money out very quickly. And so folks will have the financing, they'll have it all together. They'll, you know, they can have a great plan, but you know, folks who have all of the capital ready end up having more power in negotiations around land and housing than folks who are waiting for a check from the, you know, the city government or whatever. And so I think that that's one thing that I would, one nuance I would add to the policies that might be helpful to organize for the purpose of, you know, ultimately getting to decommodification of housing and land. But on the point that you were asking about, Steve, so there's, you know, I think that the South Baltimore Community Land Trust in Baltimore City is a really incredible example of community-led, you know, land trust, a community land trust that is doing a lot of, you know, technical assistance for folks who are going to be who will be first-time homeowners. They're, you know, working primarily with the folks who are in the area. We're organizing with young people a lot as well, and they have, but they're also moving very slowly. And so I think that that's also a thing that, like I've done know your rights trainings for them, for tenants who aspire to have a home in the future, so that they can, you know, have everything that they need and, you know, be as stable as possible and, you know, retain, you know, keep their stuff and, you know, make sure that they don't end up in a place, to the degree that it's possible, where a landlord will exploit them, or, you know, how they can hold on to their security deposit or get their security deposit from a landlord, back from a landlord that might try to keep it otherwise. because that can help with a down payment on a house, for example. There are things like that. There are lots of little different pieces that can assist in the pathway of like getting folks from being a tenant to being an owner, like a homeowner in a community land trust. I know that housing cooperatives are a little tough because it's one thing to have a cooperative and it's another thing to have a bunch of folks who own something together and are now landlords. And so like that obviously is we're trying to figure out a new relationship to property, and that's tough because we don't have a lot of other models. But I think that those are some examples of things that are happening in Baltimore that I think are really cool and really powerful. One other thing that I would add, and this is just like a cockamamie idea that I think I've been thinking about a lot that I think is really interesting, is I do think that I think that this would be most effective in a place like Baltimore, as it would be harder in the larger coastal cities, but maybe this would be helpful in other places, is I think that there are ways there's of course eminent domain, and we don't always love the way that eminent domain works out. And there's really cool organizing in Baltimore City in a historically Black neighborhood of Poppleton, which Tisha Guthrie is also integral to that organizing. But they have been fighting to hold on to their homes, and tenants and homeowners together have been organizing to hold on to that neighborhood and fighting eminent domain. And also, cities have the power to use eminent domain to take all kinds of other things like, sewer plants or, incinerators, or that's relevant to Baltimore, incinerators that are poisoning a community, things like that. And also, vacant homes that are being held onto by speculators or private equity that's not being kept up and like destroying the neighborhood. And in Baltimore City, there was recently an in rem, I think it's a judicial in rem docket that was created at the court for the city to, bring cases against properties or against properties where the owner of that property has let the place go, and there are so many violations and citations with money, like money fines attached to those violations and citations, that those violations and citations exceed the amount that the property is worth, and because of those citations and violations, they can just take the property rather than offering money to the property owner to functionally buy it, right? Which is required, just compensation for a taking, right? They don't have to do, well, I mean, it is just compensation because they owe the city the money for the citations and violations. And I think interventions like that could be really interesting because we don't have enough money to get all of the land and all of the housing. No city does, no one person does, and private equity has a lot of money. But I think that interventions like that, where like there could be a city, if there is like a friendly city council that is interested in creating a land bank that could be taking property in that way, and then handing it over to communities for their own development. I think that there are some really interesting possibilities there on the local level.
So we have a question from the audience about how state and local government could empower or even encourage the formation of tenant unions, presuming that they wanted that. And I'm going to fold in another question here on the government level, which is, does it make sense to try to get the kind of executive orders and resolutions that the Homes Guarantee campaign was looking for at the federal level at the state level as part of a scaffolding up?
I'm very curious to hear what the other answers are. I know that one thing we struggled with on a municipal level is like as an organizer, a lot of people ask me how to start a tenant union. And it's kind of like, well, you really just need an email address. But like ideally you're talking to your neighbors. And so sort of coming around on like, here's what a definition is. And then we're trying to figure out, should you write that into policy? And I reached out to like the Autonomous Tenants Union, and almost they were very resoundingly said, like, do not have that defined in law, because then they can change the law. And I get like in California recently, they've made it much more of almost like a card check situation, much more of like almost like a labor organizing thing where people have to almost have to do like an election to become like a tenant union. And that kind of stuff is going to stand in the way of organizing. So it's like for me, it's all about tenant rights. Get rid of no cause evictions, and then other stuff like, right to first refusal would be so cool. That kind of stuff, and just like create more tools and more fallbacks for people that are organizing, and more protections to make it harder for them to get evicted for no reason, and let them grow and maybe have their own property.
Yeah, I really totally agree with everything Wes just said. And I'll add, in terms of what makes sense at the state level, that's really determined by the base of people, right? Like our base has determined that our top two policy priorities are rent control and good cause eviction. We live in a GOP dominated state. Several of our largest cities have the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, which actually prevents rent control and preempts a lot of the policies that we want passed. And so there's no way that we could build out a statewide base that would win the type of policies that our base is asking for in the next couple of years. But our long-term strategy is to build out a statewide base and run those kind of campaigns when we have enough power to do that. So I think that really depends on, one, the state, the context, and then what the base is asking for. I've been on listening sessions with tenant unions all over the years, and like policies that are proportionate to those experiences are, tend to be rent control, tend to be good cause eviction, which are the exact policies that the landlord lobby fights against the most. So I think those questions really, like I said, any policy question really comes down to power. And I know as an organizer, it would be irresponsible for me to drag the base of people that I work for into a fight that's a 5-year fight that they're not going to win.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here, but so I was.
Can I add a tiny bit to that though?
Yeah, go. Sorry, Gabby, go ahead.
It's okay. So BASTA has funding restrictions that don't allow us to really engage in policy work, but I can tell you, in general, what's happened here in Austin and Texas being the wacky place that it is. So. Because of all of the work that's going on citywide, just tenant associations, our city council decided to make a local ordinance that protected the right to organize. And it passed through our city council. And then now in the legislature, like they've become so much more hostile. And you all may have heard like on the news that there was HB 2127. It was like nicknamed the Death Star bill, which preemptively took away local, but like localities couldn't make laws like this. And it was on the news a lot because one of the things that it impacted was rest breaks for construction workers. And you all have seen like the heat wave, how hot it is out here. And something so simple as like being able to take a 15-minute break. But it impacted a lot of other things. And so we're trying to see how this stuff plays out. But yeah, it's really messy. And again, like working in the South, and it made me think of something that like, I think about it a lot, but Wes brought it up. And I think what you said was like, it's like a forever war, right? Like we want this small thing locally just to get it like repealed and like for the consequences to be so much harsher, right? Like for that small win. And I think like that's something that's really difficult, not only like on a larger level, but even like just the specific campaigns that are going on at each complex, right? Like the tenants might win one of their campaigns and things are going fine for a little while. And then a few months later, management changes and you have to start all over again. And so I think that's a really hard thing because tenants, like, they want this to be over. They want to be able to move on with their lives. And part of our jobs as organizers is to make tenant association something that doesn't just spring up when there is an emergency, but something that's always there and like ready to jump into action. And that's a hard thing to sell. And it's hard for organizers too, right? It's exhausting to think that you're fighting that forever war. But yeah, that was just my 2 cents.
Thanks, Gabby, and sorry for jumping in. So I did want to ask about, so there's a question from the audience about lobbying coalition, I guess in Georgia, that's basically trying to preemptively say that the state can't regulate. So there's private equity rentals. And of course, there's a history of landlord organizations doing things like prohibiting local regulation of rents and so forth, right? So this is not new, but there has been this huge, Josh, you were talking a little bit earlier about some of the organizing you've done against private equity landlords. There's just been this huge increase in private equity ownership of property, tied, partially, facilitated by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac after the Great Recession, right? So with federal backing, this was, hundreds of thousands of units. So how has that changed the terrain of tenant organizing, and what are tools that can organize against this, and some of the legislative efforts that are being made to, keep policy out in a way?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a really good answer to that, but I can tell you what we're seeing on the ground in Louisville. Like I said, Blackstone's the largest landlord in Louisville. What we find when we look at corporate landlords is that behind those large corporate landlords, there's some form of subsidy somewhere, almost in every case. Even when there's not a clear subsidy, when you dig into it a little bit deeper, I'll just give an example. There's a corporate landlord here in Louisville from Austin, Texas. They've bought up over 1,300 properties, mostly in Louisville's West End, which is predominantly Black. And when we knock on the doors of tenants in those properties, we find people in crisis. We find eviction notices. We find move-in boxes, unlike anything I've ever seen in the 10 years I've been organizing. And when we look into where those properties came from, they were sold to a local landlord for $1 from our local land bank. So the land bank and our local governments are often in the business of repurposing land for the market. And so they're putting it back out into the market at very low cost. And then that land is being used to displace and gentrify neighborhoods. And so I think the key in battling corporate landlords is to build enough power to stop the subsidies from coming in. And that's a real strong pull in our local, state, and national work. And I think that's a real key in building a national tenant movement is working against how landlords are subsidized.
Thanks. I'll pass it to you, Noreen.
Yeah, so Josh mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to throw it open to other folks. There was a question about any working in coalition or partnership with homeowners or small business owners or good property owners. Just wanted to throw that out specifically and see if there was any other stories to add to what Josh had shared.
I can say that in Portland, one thing we are low-key trying to figure out is how to get commercial rent control to happen, because we do want to create more division, among the ruling class, and like landlords seem to think that they are the only people whose investments have been made lockdown proof, and a lot of businesses around town have closed. So trying to figure out where, the Chamber of Commerce is our like mortal foe. So we don't really work with them, but like trying to figure out how can we start to like build this consciousness and come together and like find unlikely allies, because like at the end of the day, like people need to pay rent, and definitely like working with smaller landlords has come up, but also a lot of smaller landlords are just as bad as the big ones. So we don't I don't know. That's certainly not our coalition to build.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about, connecting with other sectors. So back a while ago, Josh, I think you've made some parallels. You were speaking about some of the similarities between tenant organizing and labor organizing. Anneke, I thought were very persuasive in terms of the impact of mass incarceration and the need for abolition to actually address housing justice. So, how do we make some of those connections more explicit and organized across sectors?
I like that question. I think this is really key. And I'll just give an example of where I'm from in Eastern Kentucky. I mean, Eastern Kentucky, people think of it as a red area now, but it wasn't that long ago that it was as strong. It was as strong a Democratic base as anywhere in the country. And that's because there were labor unions there in the coal industry. And there were also subsidies for tobacco. And now that those things are gone, the GOP has been able to really exploit the contradictions of the Democratic Party and turn those states over. I think it's important to realize that the GOP hasn't taken over Kentucky because people where I'm from are necessarily racist or homophobic. They've been able to take over because they are organizing and no one else is. And if one group of people is organizing and no one else is organizing, then that group of people is going to win. So they've been able to organize a very, very small minority and take over the whole state. We really can't go into places like Eastern Kentucky where you have 40% unemployment and do labor organizing anymore. We simply don't have the number. We don't have the numbers to do that. And I think that's where tenant organizing can really step in the South and create a new power structure that's very far to the left of the traditional Democratic Party in the state. And keep in mind, it's not as if the Democratic Party is not very much tied to real estate also. And so I think this is really the way we turn red states around is through tenant organizing. I mean, and we live in a world right now dominated by, completely designed and controlled by real estate capital. We live in a world designed by Donald Trump's father. And so we have to organize against that power structure, and tenant organizing is the way to do that. And like I said before at the top, it's really about controlling the rent and creating a critical mass in this country of people that can one day decide not to pay their rent and then dictate our demands.
So I have a question about how tenant organizing is funded currently and how should it be funded?
One thing that I just wanted to say about this, and I want to let everybody else talk, because they will have more to offer than I do. So since somebody asked earlier about working with homeowners or good landlords or whatever, something that we've talked about in Baltimore a good amount is organizing a homeowner solidarity coalition that contributes to fund the tenant organizing. And I think that something like that is could be really impactful if there are folks on this call who are interested in sort of engaging homeowners, handing over all of that unearned equity that you're getting as a homeowner. I say this as a homeowner myself, and this is what I try to do is passing that on in solidarity with the folks who are tenants, because we want to be investing in our neighborhoods, everybody who lives in our neighborhoods, not just other people who are homeowners. And we always have so much more power in these political conversations locally and at the state level. And it's absolutely unreasonable. So the least we can do is fork some of that equity over.
Great. Thanks, Anneke. I think I want to ask about, so 2 years ago, Shelter Force and MPQ did a webinar on social housing, and there's been a lot of movement in some places. There are literally 3 bills in California, of trying to, who knows if any of them will pass, but they're certainly being debated in the state legislature there to, create a sector of housing that is more tied to public and community ownership. And I didn't know if that was reaching any of your communities or if that's even part of the conversation, but I was wondering how you thought of that as an approach.
So there's a tenant association that we have been working with that was owned by like a county entity, and it was really, really bad shape. And so for a minute there was a proposal to it was kind of like that. It was like the market coming in to fix it, like they were gonna do mixed income housing. And really like there's an apartment side and they were gonna build up and like make it more dense. And I know for that community, it ended up not happening. They were really opposed to having their community changed in that way. And so as far as social housing, like I think it's the way that it's implemented. Like if it was something new being built and people were choosing to go into that. But in this situation, it was like happening to them and they were very, very against it. And they decided like that they did not want that developer to come and work with them. So it was just interesting for me because in theory, it sounds like in theory it could work. It was just it was such a strong reaction from the tenants who were living there that they did not want this.
Thanks. Miriam?
I just wanted to give anyone else a chance to weigh in on how tenant organizing should be funded or is currently funded.
I'll try to do that. I'll try to be real quick with that. I think funders should be really clear on what organizing is and the difference between a member-led org and the larger nonprofits. We have a lot of really large nonprofits in Kentucky that get, they have $5 million budgets, and they were designed when the Democrats were in power to show up and kind of stop bad bills by the GOP. And they're still doing that, and they're getting a lot of funding. And one of the things we've seen in Kentucky is that now that tenant organizing is a thing, a lot of larger nonprofits that may not actually be member-led are co-opting tenant organizing, co-opting tenant power, and getting a lot of funding on the back of that. So I think it's real clear to ask people, if they say they're doing tenant organizers, how many leaders do you have in your base? What's your leadership development strategy? What training are you offering? How do you make strategic decisions? If I go into a courtroom and pretend to be a lawyer, I'm going to get charged with a felony. But if a lawyer, claims to be a tenant organizer, they get foundation money. And I think we really need to get clear on what we're talking about when we say tenant organizing.
Well, we're almost at time, so I do want to, I don't know if there's any last comments anyone else wants to make, but if not, we can go to the closing slide. And I just want to thank Miriam in particular, my co-moderator, for helping organize this session. And of course, our panelists, Anneke Dunbar-Gronke, Gabriela Garcia, Josh Poe, and Wes Pelletier. Their contact information is there. These slides will also be sent out with the recording afterwards. So, and many thanks to all of you for your really outstanding questions. Miriam and I tried to get to as many of them as we could. We certainly didn't get to them all, but I hope you found this to be a useful conversation. And we've been doing these webinars for a few years now on housing justice issues, and we'll certainly be doing them in the future. So thanks so much for your participation.